Today we talk about what happens when your best embryo doesn't work and why that doesn't mean you're out of hope.
I'm Dr. Mark Amols, and this is Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.
Today, we're diving deep into why a failed transfer, even with your top embryo, doesn't mean you're out of options. But let's be real. You're told this is your best embryo. You transfer it, you wait, you test, and it's negative. And now your brain goes to that spot and asks, if the best didn't work, why would the others work? This is totally valid. It feels like the floor dropped out. But what patients often don't realize is this best doesn't mean guaranteed. It doesn't even mean that much better when we're talking about embryos that already passed the transfer criteria. So what do I mean by that? I'm saying some embryos are at least good enough. And it doesn't have to be the best to have success. One analogy I came up with is the idea of becoming a doctor. Getting into medical school is hard, but everyone who makes it is going to be very sharp. Now, some people are going to pass their exams with higher grades. Some people are going to pass their boards in the first try. But at the end of the day, some do become neurosurgeons and others become family doctors. Now, the doctors with the better scores, they may get into the more competitive programs, such as neurosurgeons. And there's going to be some doctors who end up becoming family doctors in, let's say, some programs that aren't as competitive, and yet they're still very good doctors. Matter of fact, they could have even had some of the highest grades in medical school. The point is, the family doctor still saves lives. The family doctor still diagnoses, treats, and heals. Well, embryos are the same. Not every embryo is a neurosurgeon. But if it's been selected for transfer, it's still a doctor. That means that embryo passed their boards. It can do the job. Just like medical school doesn't let people graduate who don't meet the criteria, we don't transfer embryos that are not viable. So basically, if we're putting it in your uterus, it's because it has a chance. The point is, there is a minimum threshold that they must meet to be able to consider for transfer. And once they do, they're in the game. So again, whether your embryo looks like a neurosurgeon with perfect ICM, a beautiful trophectoderm and expanded exactly on day 5, or you might have an embryo that's a solid family doctor, average morphology, slower development, guess what? They all have the potential to succeed. So let's talk about what do we mean by best embryo? We're not talking about your embryo is going to become the smartest kid or the healthiest kid. We can't even guarantee that it's going to be the one that has success. What it means is that statistically, when we look at certain features, there is a higher probability that that embryo will do better than the others. But this is just statistics. No one actually knows the embryo is going to do better. There are so many other things that can be involved. But let's first focus on morphology. That's where we look under the microscope, we look at the embryo, and we then assess certain things. One of them is called the intracellular mass. This is the part that becomes the baby. It's usually abbreviated ICM. The next thing we look at is the trophectoderm. This part is what becomes the placenta. And then the third thing we look at is the expansion and how far along it is in the blastocyst stage. This usually comes as a grade with a number, which represents the stage, the first letter, which represents the ICM, and the last letter that represents the trophectoderm. So an embryo graded AA means it looks pristine. Both the inner cell mass and the trophectoderm look very good. BB would be considered average, and CC would be considered the lowest quality. Now, if you listen to one of my prior podcasts about grading, you would know that some clinics do it different. Some use a scoring system that uses 3 letters or 3 numbers. Some use one that has 6 letters or 6 numbers. In the situation where there are 3 letters, such as A, B, C, C will be the worst. B would be completely average. Now, in the system where there's an A, B, C, D, E, F, C is just above average, and the letters below it are going to be the worst. So what does the research say about this? The research does show that there is some benefit to highly graded morphology, meaning A's are better than B's and greater than C's. And we also know that more of the euploid embryos will come from the A's versus B versus C's. In one study, they had a 76% ongoing pregnancy rate when they put back embryos with ICM grade A, but that dropped down to 13% when putting back a grade C embryo. Now to note, that was with the 3 grading system called the Gardner system. Now when you add euploid status, this starts to shrink. The difference isn't as great, and that's because now you remove the embryos that were abnormal. But what's interesting was that big of a drop, the question is, what about the ones that are A versus B? Well, the difference was smaller. Think like 60 versus 50. That's a shift, but it's not the difference between hope and no chance. It appears through a lot of these studies that ICM is a major component in determining whether an embryo will work or not. Now, it's important for every clinic to figure out what works best for them. We look at our data all the time and we look at what works best at our clinic. So the point you should take from this is not that the ICM is more important, but just the fact that morphology does play a small part, and that reduces whenever you do testing. And it also is a smaller drop when you compare A's and B's versus A's and C's. The point here is that if your best embryo was an AA and didn't work, and now you have a PB or even a BC embryo left, it's still a chance. And if your clinic only transfer embryos that are average or better, like we do, then every embryo you transfer is still med school quality. They're all trained. They all can do the job. But let's go a little deeper, because even perfect embryos fail, and sometimes average embryos succeed. The question is, why? Well, that's because the embryo is just one part of the equation. One part we don't think about is the uterus. Yes, we check the uterus, we make sure it looks good, but what if there's inflammation in there that we're not realizing? Or what if maybe there's polyps that were undiagnosed? Or what if the timing's off and the person needs an ERA test? All those things will make even a perfect embryo not work. One thing we don't think about too is the thawing process. Sure, an embryo may survive the thaw, but who knows that the embryo didn't suffer some issues, such as maybe it's on its way out and you don't know it. Now you put this embryo back, which you think is normal, looks beautiful, but in reality, that embryo was already dying, and you didn't know that. And now you feel that you didn't get pregnant because you thought your best embryo didn't work, when in reality, your best embryo didn't have a chance because even though it survived the thaw, it didn't survive the thaw as well as you thought. And then there's just bad luck sometimes. We know the human body isn't a math equation. Even with perfect conditions, sometimes it just doesn't work. Studies estimate that even for euploid, high-quality blastocyst, the chance of implantation is around 60 to 65%, not 100%. So even your best embryo failing doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means you played the odds and came up short this time. So let's circle back to the big question. If the best embryo didn't work, is there still hope? Absolutely. And that's because best means graded on a curve. It's not graded on the destiny of that embryo. It's because all embryos transferred are considered viable. Because even average embryos result in babies. Every single day we see this. And if you got more embryos, it means you've got more chances. One of the most important things I tell my patients are, a failed transfer isn't a failed cycle. It's just a step in the process. Don't get me wrong. It's absolutely scary. Even just one transfer failing can make you lose hope. And having an embryo that you're told is the best embryo of the best failing feels like the floor just dropped out from under you. But now you know that that grading just means it had potential. It doesn't mean it's going to guarantee success. And when it doesn't work, it doesn't mean we shouldn't worry that there could be problems. But you should look at it more that it doesn't mean that there's also something wrong. Whether it's your AA embryo or your average embryo, if you still have an embryo left, you still have a chance. I don't want you to lose hope. The difference between the best embryos and the average embryos is not as great as the best embryos and the worst embryos. What I can tell you is most clinics do not freeze bad embryos. If they do, it doesn't make it wrong, but it's important for you then to know what are the chances then with those embryos if they only use a 3-grade system. If your clinic doesn't transfer those embryos, then you know your embryos are either average or better, and that the difference is going to be small. So, the next time you feel defeated after a failed transfer, remember, not every embryo is a neurosurgeon, but sometimes the family doc comes in and saves the day. Just remember, all embryos finish embryo school and are all destined for potential success. Thanks for joining me again on this week's Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday. If this episode helps shift your mindset, maybe share it with someone who needs it. As always, I greatly appreciate everyone that listens to this podcast. If you love us, give us a 5-star review on your favorite medium, but most of all, keep coming back. I look forward to talking to you again next week on Taco Bout Fertility Tuesday.